All right, we'll get started. Okay, welcome everyone. First I'll announce what's going on next week. Next week actually might be a pretty similar talk, but from a probably different perspective. Bill Cannon, head of renewables from Sumitomo Corporation, which is a large industrial conglomerate in Japan with offices in 65 countries around the world, and his talk is going to be entitled Adapting from Grid to Cloud. So I think there's going to be a similar sort of information in the grid theme, but from a multinational sort of perspective. Today I am pleased to introduce Bob King, or Robert King, no relation to myself, so we just happen to have the same name, and he happens to have the same initials as my dad. So he's been around the energy scene for a long time. He's got a lot of knowledge, so I think he's agreed to take questions throughout his talk. So if you have a question as we go along, please feel free to ask. He's been around electric system restructuring in Texas, knows a lot about that, was involved in the developing of the regulations. If you have a question about the rules and regulations and policies and markets about electricity, I think we have the man here to help talk about some of those issues if you have a burning question, aside from his talk today about looking at the Internet of Things and information to help us operate the grid going forward. So with that introduction, Bob, take it away.
Thanks, Kerry. Actually, we are going to get into the electric market a little bit. I was assuming that I would kind of have to explain some of that for some of you, but by a show of hands, how many people know what ERCOT is? Oh, good. We have a relatively, so you hang around Kerry too much. And you're familiar with wholesale markets and that sort of thing. And oh, good, an educated audience. Okay, well, some of these slides may be superfluous, and we may want to spend more time on questions. I'll try and move through. So I titled this, Will the Internet of Things Affect the Electric Business or have an impact or change it? Because there's an awful lot of talk about what's going on in the Internet of Energy things, all the connected devices, and if you students already know about electric markets and so on, you know, a lot of people are talking about the promise of smart grid and connected devices and that sort of thing to have an impact on the market. But I've been working over the last few years with some of the people in that space and have personal knowledge, including bruises, to show for trying to find ways for that to actually happen, because actually doing it in the real world is proving a little bit challenging. There's a number of things we'll talk about today. I'll provide a little bit of insight into what some of those market challenges are. I'll give you some history about where some of these things came from, because it helps explain where we are today. And I'll tell you about some of the challenges which since I'm talking to a bunch of students, I would tell you really highlight incredible number of job opportunities in the future of this industry, because all the things that we have to overcome each suggest new areas of employment, frankly, where we need people to be able to help solve some of the problems that we'll be facing. So this is one of those maybe you don't need, but I mean, the Internet of Things is quite broad. Obviously, there's security, healthcare, energy is only one of several verticals that are seeing automation, communications, and IT impact the way they do business, and all kinds of things, even in mass markets, are becoming connected in a variety of ways. One of the things I wanted to say about this, though, particularly since our focus is energy, energy is probably not going to be the killer app. There are a lot of people get excited about what energy appliance or application can do, but in terms of what's really motivating people to buy things, I think Nest was an interesting moment in history, in the sense that who'd have thought a thermostat would become sexy enough that you'd want to pay $250 to have one on the wall and tell your neighbors about it and that kind of thing. But and I'm not saying it's a one-off, but you notice there's not a huge flow of other things that are just energy. What you're seeing is, I think the next big thing was Ring, where people used to see who's ringing the doorbell or stealing your packages or whatever. I think what we're going to see, and I think there's a fair amount of agreement on this, is that it's going to take some time for more comprehensive packages of residential level services to really get the mass market engaged in this. People, for instance, with security companies or security platform like SmartThings offers, or Energy Hub and Alarm.com, for example, where they really kind of set up your whole home, and energy appliances or energy equipment controls and so on are part of that. Obviously, entertainment is one of the things that's driving the market. And one of the biggest things having an impact on the uptake of all this technology are the new voice command technologies, the Alexa and the other kinds of devices are driving a lot more people to have these things, and then they're finding out how to connect those to other things and so on. But it's a lot of non-energy things that are primarily driving the market. So partly we're waiting for that wave to kind of build up and somehow get organized. The other thing I'd say right off the bat that makes it a little bit challenging for the mass market to really pick up on these things is that the building community even is sort of a very, I don't want to call it unorganized, but distributed industry itself. I don't know how many thousands of home builders there are. Probably about 30 companies build about 80% of the homes, the tract homes and so on. And we're finding penetration on some of those new homes. But even there, they have trouble finding contractors because contracting tends to be local, and training local contractors and so on to understand and be willing to do more advanced technology in homes is kind of a challenge. So again, there's some other elements of the wave to impact housing and built environment that are going to have to come along. But as we do get these things in place, I think it's interesting to note that there's this, I think of this kind of an increasing complexity, but also increasing value as you go from left to right. I mean, even with just the old once a month meter reading, you can get a certain amount of data that's interesting, but you know, you look at your bill every month, right? But you go to the new digital meter, and now you've got maybe 15-minute reads. You can begin to tell a little bit more. The early developments were like just a display in your home to show you what your consumption was doing currently. This little picture you can hardly see, the eye chart thing with color there. It's a little example of a sort of a scorecard, report card that Whisker Labs put out that they can kind of tease out of that data how the air conditioner is running, or they can see when other appliances are running. They can tell whether your house faces south or not. With 15-minute data and other publicly available data like weather, the age of the home, that sort of thing, Whisker Labs, who I did quite a bit of work for the last 5 or 6 years, they literally build a thermodynamic model of each individual home automatically through about 18 algorithms that they've evolved over time. And they can then very quickly, after a period of a month or two, know how your home is going to respond to any number of external influences. And they can do things then to optimize your air conditioner and so on. So that's kind of the next level. You have notifications, the modeling I just mentioned, but notifications like we're noticing something, your air conditioner is not achieving the set point. It's been long enough that the temperature should have come down and it hasn't. You should probably call somebody to have a look at it for repairs. And ultimately, you know, the phone is the mobile device that we all want to be able to control our lives from these days, and there are more and more applications being built to use the various streams of data that are available in order to put those kind of controls in your hand. I have several applications of my own that control things in my home, so I think that's kind of the direction things are going, although they're, like I said, they're kind of going one device at a time, one app at a time. It's not real organized. It's almost like we don't yet have a smart home. We have a lot of smart things and some communications, but the integration is, back to the integration issue. So I said how kind of discombobulated the construction industry is. If you think about the intelligence in cars, that's gotten integrated really well over a period of time. There's so much intelligence in cars because that's a really vertically integrated industry. They have a lot of control of the whole supply chain, so they can tell people how they want to get things, how they go in and how they get integrated together. People build parts for that car. We just aren't doing buildings that way yet, but still, it's pretty popular. You can't read this whole thing, but just to show you, Parts Associates are doing lots of polling for the people in the space to try and see who likes what and try and tell. Only point I was trying to make here is that a significant number of the broadband households that they've surveyed find these very appealing. There's a whole list of things: use sensors to automatically turn off lights and appliances when the home is unoccupied, receive alerts when the energy use is high, identify problems with major appliances, etc. All these things are attractive. And in fact, they found that people are even willing to pay for them. Although I would say people say this on surveys more than they actually do it. For years, people said they'd be willing to pay extra for solar, for example, but they tend not to actually do it in real life. So somewhere between here and reality is the, or between here and zero is the reality. This actually brings out another kind of interesting issue. So one of the things that the people in the industry of making connected devices are facing is when you buy a thermostat, you think you own that thermostat, right? It's on your wall, it's out of the box, maybe you paid an electrician to put it in. But the fact is, you want it to stay connected, so you have a Honeywell thermostat. You want Honeywell to keep that connected and functioning. In fact, they're keeping up their back office software, updating it. They're updating yours remotely. They're sending you messages maybe. They're sending you alerts that may be associated with it. All this is a service that you get along with it. So over time, they have almost no upside from owning that piece of equipment. Once they sell it to you, they've got all the money they're going to get from you, and then nothing but downside. You complain to them if it doesn't work right or something like that. So one of the reasons that this whole issue of how do these things interact with the marketplace even comes up is because that's an opportunity for these manufacturers to create an ongoing revenue stream from the value that this device creates, right? So every one of these manufacturers that have something on the internet highway looks at it as a toll booth. In some way, they are trying to figure out how do they get a continuing revenue stream somewhere from that. Now, that's good in some ways. It drives them to be creative, and it gives opportunity to impact energy markets in lots of good ways, but it also creates a barrier internally. So this is something that has to be kind of worked out with the industry because it's kind of stacking up people that want to get a payment out of a relatively limited amount of value that's created on a very small thing, like let's say a thermostat, right? So Honeywell makes the thermostat, they have the back office, but Whisker Labs has the algorithms that optimize it and the communications, and they're the weather company on top of everything else, so they're supporting that. You may want to give the homeowner some kind of rebate for good behavior, or you want to send them newsletters, or whatever. There are costs involved in all of that, and there's a relatively small value from each thermostat. Yeah? How does Nest currently operate? That's a very broad question. Can you narrow it? It is. It's a one-time payment. They're pretty much like everybody else. In fact, I've told the guys at Nest that I think as they scale up, they may regret some of their business plan, because the other thing is they're actually giving some payments to their customers that participate in what they call rush hour rewards, the demand response program, whereas really customers can benefit from just reducing their bills, and you could do that without actually having to pass cash along, which creates kind of a cash flow problem. But anyway, I just want to show there is a supposedly willingness to pay, but the manufacturers are very reluctant to do it. You'll see, really frankly, in the early years of this, and even still today, Nest and Honeywell, Ecobee, everybody really just wants utility rebates to help pay for the cost even of the thermostat, right? So $125 rebate in Chicago or PG&E in California or wherever, that helps get the thermostat into the house and reduce the cost that their customers see, but they still have this ongoing expense. But anyway, for one reason or another, 26% of American, well, at least broadband households, so not low income or rental households, but single households with broadband, 26% of them have some connected device already. Many of those are thermostats. 40% of new homes, even given the sort of vulcanized nature of that industry, include a thermostat or some connected device in their new home. So anyway, I think the answer to my first question, will the Internet of Things change the electric business? The answer is yes, ultimately, whether it's integrated in the market or it's just individual customers using devices to try and reduce their own energy bill or change the way they consume for a variety of reasons, it's going to have an impact, but maybe more interesting to talk about when. How long is this going to take? All these things that I'm beginning to raise as possible barriers or points that have yet to be settled in the industry are going to determine maybe how long this is going to take. And utility industry itself just isn't really known for innovation, right? So a lot of this industry seems to change a little more slowly than others. So there are other areas of technology that are moving way faster than what you see in the electric market. And the interface of these two creates some tension that will help slow it down some. Let's talk a little bit of history, though. Almost everybody here said that they knew about ERCOT, but sort of think about where all these things came from. When we first started off, I mean, you had Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse were fighting over AC/DC and building individual power plants and then running feeder lines from a power plant out to certain loads, and they were mostly isolated, right? Over 100 and some years, all those started connecting together so that the country is more or less covered by these grids with local power plants and lines running together. And the weak point in the grid was always sort of out at the tips of those fingers in between things, right? But then in the last, really 30, 40 years even, as those start to fill in, we've been building a lot more transmission lines, making the whole network more robust. And what you see on this map is the areas where you had regional transmission organizations, we call them. And that doesn't mean that the rest of the country is in the dark, but they are still, in some ways, the kind of old style, vertically integrated, separate utilities that kind of meet at the weak points in between them. These others have really worked hard at trying to interconnect, and it was partly so that one utility to the left or the right of you could help you if you had higher demand on one afternoon, or you can shift power back and forth within it, and even these days in between these areas, mid-continental ISO or the old RTO and PJM interconnection exchange quite a bit of power these days. Southwest Power Pool tends to be a little more isolated, and Texas is the one where we only have ties to the other grid areas with direct current lines. And even though that is interconnection and it is for economic reasons, we say it's for emergency only, and it's kind of a political compromise that was made many years ago that if we don't really interconnect on a daily basis at AC and essentially be more integrated with the rest of these regions, that we don't engage in interstate commerce. So we are not regulated by the federal government. This one little gray area at the bottom, this part of Texas, if you didn't know, is regulated only by the Texas Public Utility Commission. So here, the PUC is both the Federal Energy Regulatory Authority and the state, or we just don't have a federal authority. But anyway, so the other thing then that happened though is we started having economies of scale were seen in the electric business. Like when I was coming up in it in the 70s, growth was 7% a year. We're building power plants like crazy. And it kept getting more and more efficient to build bigger power plants and build these big transmission lines and build out the network so you could shift power back and forth. But then we started building big nuclear power plants, and they kind of busted that whole mold because we started having huge cost overruns, and consumers and legislators got upset about that. And Enron, actually, one of the people that kind of took that whole thing a little bit too far, was one of the creative folks that came forward and said, well, what we really need is competition in this element of the electric business. Let us build power plants and compete with the utilities. Why should they get to build their own on a cost plus basis, right? Or they'd come in and they'd propose a nuclear plant at $2 billion. And if it turned out to be $6 billion, there was nothing you could do. You just suck it up and pay your bills. So at some point we said no, and we started creating wholesale energy markets where other competitors could come in and build power plants, right? And then these RTOs became ISOs, or independent system operators, that were beginning to take over not only the grid itself, but the transactions related to the buying and selling of electricity at wholesale. And the list of things here, the four points, is the list of things that the organization of RTOs and ISOs, called the IRC Council, said is their responsibility. I would say one of the things that's interesting about the way these things set up, and we'll talk about a little bit more further on, is point number 4, they claim that part of their job is fostering innovation. But let me tell you, there's another side to this too, because each of these organizations are nonprofit organizations that are set up and controlled by boards of stakeholders. Now, some of them have more or less independent boards, but still the processes that take place underneath them to set up the rules for the markets are driven by stakeholders. And the problem with that is the incumbent stakeholders tend to be the big dogs, and the emerging technologies, they have the small budgets and the VC capital funding and trying to get in there and find a handhold on the cliff face, are generally turned away and frustrated by the rules of these things getting set up in a way that make it hard for new technologies to participate. So let's think about what wholesale markets include. So first of all, there's just the selling of electricity every 5 minutes, like I said, and settlement every 15. So there are computers keeping track of who bought how much and who sold how much to serve which customers and all that kind of stuff, and the losses in transmission all the complexities you can imagine of moving electricity from the power plants across the country to all the homes and businesses and factories. So there's a real-time market in which people bid in and then are responsible for meeting obligations. It's picked by essentially an ongoing auction that is based on the fact that they have some kind of financial stake in it. If you bid into the market and you don't perform, then you pay a penalty. And if you offer the lowest price, you get picked. You're in we say in the stack. They take all the bids and they stack them up, and they take just enough at the marginal price to meet whatever the demand is at that 5-minute window. And everybody in the stack then has to perform, and there are penalties for not doing it. Now, in case nobody shows up, we have ancillary services, including reserves, we call them, or some standby power plants. So if somebody doesn't show up or a plant trips off, that there are other things to come in, because you've got to manage in real time, obviously. But we're also managing every 4 seconds, frequency of the system. All those things are separate. We say markets, but they're really just auctions that take place for those specific things. And originally were all designed around these power plants that were out there already, right? It's like instead of just the utility internally looking at their dashboards and saying, oh, turn up that power plant or what have you, and often in the old days, of course, most of those would just be analog situation, whereas the frequency starts to go on the system, the generators spin faster automatically. This is all now in sort of real-time price signals going out to all the participants with responsibility for performing in the market as often as every 4 seconds. Again, mostly for politics, some folks weren't comfortable that an energy-only auction every 5 minutes was going to really make sure and make us comfortable we can go to bed at night and know that there'll be enough power the next day. So in every market except the Electric Reliability Council in Texas, where we are still using energy-only market, they adopted a capacity market. A capacity market is, again, just another auction where anybody that has capacity to produce power basically puts in a bid for a forward period in which they say we will have capacity available to deliver energy. And so generally what they do is if they are picked for their capacity price, they then have an obligation to produce later in the energy market, right? Is this too basic for everybody? Should I be going faster, or is this helpful? Okay. So this will become relevant because I'm still talking about power plants, right? Now, there's one more element that I'll just touch on, and that is then we added retail competition, which really what we did, and people called it deregulation, but now we call it restructuring. Basically what we did was we took the 3 elements of the electric business and sort of unbundled those, and we have retail markets, which is just marketing. In fact, you could be a retail electric provider in Texas out of your bedroom, and some companies started that way. You don't have to own anything except communications and marketing. You can hire someone. You have to have a certain capacity we call a qualified scheduling entity, and they're the only entity that can talk to the market. So they're basically integrated through APIs to the computer system that runs these auctions. But you can hire one of those, right? So you make an agreement with somebody that has supply to deliver enough to meet the demand for the customers that you've sold onto your retail product, and you hire a qualified scheduling entity to schedule it into the market, and then afterwards settle up and make sure you get paid for what was delivered, or that you pay for what you had to use, serve your customer, and then you have to bill your customer. So generation was already deregulated or restructured to the extent that it now is competitive. So anybody can build a power plant that wants and make that available to the market. Retailers then can make a contract with them, or you can just offer it yourself into the market and go with the real-time pricing, but people tend to use contracts to take some risk out of that. We can talk about it if you want. But the only thing left, for instance, in Texas that's still regulated, in fact, in the law, the only thing that is a utility, by definition, is the poles and the wires, and we added back in meters. And at one point, Enron talked them into taking the meters out. They thought that would be competitive, but whether you have a red meter or blue meter, turns out it doesn't really matter, right? In fact, that's a whole nother story, but I helped pass the law to put meters back into the utility business, because what we really needed was mass deployment of meters so we could have the data associated with that, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But anyway, so the idea of the market, this is actually off the ERCOT website. You can look at this, go to the ERCOT website every day, and you'll see, here's today. This is the graph of how much power is available and how much power is being demanded. It's a nice, cool afternoon. This was from April 4 when I was putting this together. That was the day I put this together. And so anyway, now things start getting complicated, though, with all the new kind of resources coming in. Traditional generation that the market was built for tends to kind of start up slow, and once it gets going, there was a coal plant in Houston. I did some work for the company. It was actually a pet coke plant. I didn't realize, but it took them 6 hours to get up full steam, that plant. So very slow starting things. So you can imagine the way they would bid into the market would be, they want to sell a big chunk, and you have to buy a big chunk, and you have to buy it for quite some time. So that would be what we call a base load plant. You want it to run pretty consistently, and it's not going to respond quickly to things. But we really built the market around things like that, or gas turbines that take 15, 30 minutes, an hour to get going and want to keep going once they're up. But, you know, you look at wind, it's there when the wind blows, right? Or solar when the sun shines. Storage, very fast responding, like milliseconds it can respond to a demand, and using electronic controls can be very finely ramped up and down, but it doesn't last very long. So again, it's very different from a power plant that wants to go for hours and hours. Storage can be there right away, can provide a certain high quality power, but only for a short duration. And all this intelligent Internet of Energy things that we're talking about, what are they? They're associated with buildings mostly. Buildings are a significant part of the market. I don't want to go there yet, but they're also sensitive to weather, right? So when there is demand in the building, then you can modify that demand with electronics and intelligence and that sort of thing. So these are very different kind of resources. The other thing I wanted to say about the market that you wouldn't realize if I didn't mention, all these dots on here are nodes, we call them, in the ERCOT market. And the price of electricity is literally calculated at every one of those every 5 minutes. So it's not just that there's a single auction going on, but it depends on where your power is located and where the demand is and how much resistance in the system. And so are you electrical engineers I'm talking to? So you may know that the resistance in the system determines where the flow is. So where the power goes literally from and to is determined by those sorts of things, and that creates congestion on the system, and that makes it harder to get power from some places to other places. So you end up having, this is actually a price profile. That's not cloud map or something. That's a price map. This, interestingly enough, I thought you'd find this interesting. On that same day, April 4, all the dark blue areas are actually negative prices. So all the West Texas, we were actually paying people to take this electricity. That's a whole nother story you can ask me a question about, but it's because of all the wind power out there. The wind was blowing, yet it was a cool day. We didn't need the electricity as bad, and so we were actually having to turn off power plants that were normally on to allow the wind plants to continue, and some of the wind plants may have even been curtailed. But the question then comes like, now all of a sudden we're talking about distributed resources where homes can have solar on the roof and that sort of thing, but how do you begin to figure out how to compensate somebody with a solar collector on the roof that wants to export? Or let's say I was with Sunrun yesterday at FERC. They are aggregating groups of homes like this as a resource, trying to bid them into the energy market. But they may have these that go across multiple nodes, right? They may have whole swath of Texas with customers in it, and ERCOT has to figure out, well, how do I price distributed resources going into the market from aggregation of little loads that are all over the place like a cloud or a smear or something on this thing. So we're actually at ERCOT trying to work out things like, well, could we pick a virtual node that's kind of the average center where this takes place? Or is this kind of a problem? Because do you actually, when you call that resource, do you actually make congestion worse if it's got, turns out, more of its aggregation on one side of a constraint than on the other side, right? When you're trying to get the electricity from point A to point B. So in New York, for example, it was going to be very difficult for, I was where I mentioned Whisker Labs, one of the companies I worked for the last few years. We would have 550 nodes that we would have to put our aggregations together on. So what does that mean for, again, having the Internet of Things participate in the energy market? There was we talked them into having a minimum requirement of 100 kilowatts to participate in the market. It's just because of limitations of their computer system. They couldn't go down to every home and do them individually, and that would be weird for us. We wanted to aggregate all our customers together and say, hey, we can provide, let's say, 20 megawatts of load reduction when you call on us. And they said, well, you've got to have at least 100 kilowatts, and that's about 100 thermostats. So I've got to go out and market 100 homes behind each of 550 nodes in order for those to then register as a resource in that market. Now, we talked them into 125. We consolidated down, sort of really focusing on where the congestion points were. But still, this is a big kind of technical and marketing challenge for a newcomer to the Internet of Things, trying to be an energy market, is we had to figure out how to organize around these nodes. Every one of the markets has similar kind of problem. Yeah.
So just to clarify that.
I want to say 1,200. May not be that many, but we're a big state. And there's a lot of them. You can't see them all because there's a huge number in some of the real populated areas too, where differences. It may not be that many. Don't quote me on that, but there's a huge number of nodes. Now, we have not yet in Texas tried to force that issue, and we're allowing, for instance, an emergency response service where homes can participate. We just do it system-wide, so we just do it all the way across the state. And frankly, for demand response, which I'll talk about a little, they're just reducing demand. That's less impactful than putting power onto the market in a way, right? Because that just calms the whole thing. Whatever your situation is, it's less bad if there's less demand. But if you called a big aggregation across the state of solar systems, and they tended to be on the wrong side of congestion constraints, you may not be helping the problem you've got. So we're gonna face this problem here. In fact, the big solar systems in the West Texas things are all associated with a specific node, right? But as we get more distributed resources, anyway, this is something that's becoming kind of an issue around. And, you know, this is the famous duck curve you've probably seen already, but in California where, you know, normally this is your midday peak here around noon from the heat of the day and people are at work, and then there's a peak when people come home at night and turn everything on and cook dinner and come back from a run, take a shower, whatever it is. Well, this is a progression of the California peak has now become the belly of the duck. They are already, in fact, they're ahead of what their projection was in the middle of the day because of their solar. Their profile has changed completely, where that's now a period where they have excess capacity. And more challenging, they have about 30 megawatts a minute that they have to come back on as the sun goes down out there, right? 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts in an hour or two to ramp back up again when those solar systems start falling off and people are still coming home and wanting to take their shower or fix dinner or whatever. So that's another sort of challenging thing for the market. And we're trying to figure out, so why is this relevant to the Internet of Things? Again, if the Internet of Things is trying to control demand, well, we used to think that what you wanted was some way to moderate your demand in the middle of the day. Now in California, we have a working group trying to figure out if we can consume energy in the middle of the day in a useful way in order to then reduce that ramp in the afternoon. And actually, all those granite countertops and things that people want in their new home turn out to be great thermal storage devices. So again, I'll come back to that, but actually pre-cooling space while the sun is shining and the demand is really low actually reduces the need then for cooling the home when people come back from work. So anyway. One of the things I wanted to just say about, you know, challenges for all this is that the fact that we have all these wholesale markets and that each one of them is actually different and each has these stakeholder groups that are developing the rules for the auction make it really challenging for folks to get in the market. If you're Nest or Ecobee or Whisker Labs or Energy Hub, the structure of the protocol or rules or whatever, what? Oh, 15 minutes? Oh gosh, okay. So I have to go faster. You have to register resources, how they operate is different. In PJM, for example, well no, let me go forward. So anyway, different rules in every place. The other thing is just the complexity across the states of how many states have, for instance, retail competition is another layer where it's different all across the country. And then, frankly, you've got to interact with or communicate and coordinate with the local utility. And they're, you know, numerous and weird shapes and, you know, somebody right across the street could be in a different market. So let's talk about demand response as an example. We've talked about it some. It's voluntary reduction in either in response to a price signal or an emergency signal. A whole sort of industry of third-party providers has grown up to try and figure out how to use these devices in homes to control demand in relation to supply in a timely way and be able to respond to the market. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission created a rule that said, in fact, we have the right to be participants. It was fought by the power plant guys, as you might imagine. They really don't like competition. Nobody really likes competition, I guess. But the Supreme Court upheld that February a year ago. At the same time, that same rule said, okay, but as a trade-off, all the states have the right to prohibit customers participating directly in the market or through a third party. So it's almost, it's kind of interesting. You remember what Mason's and Dixon's line looked like. It's very close to where the Southern Company, Duke, Tennessee Valley Authority, they're all very different, and they don't have wholesale markets, and they don't allow customers to participate in anything. But in some of the yellow, they just prohibit it because the utilities are still kind of controlling those markets and so on. Anyway, there's a variety of, again, just differences. So if you're trying to be a national product, that's very challenging. Let's see. So the other thing that's challenging about this is that I mentioned that all these loads are weather sensitive, the building loads. So this is a ERCOT market on a shoulder day or an off-peak day and on a peak day. And you notice that almost the entire peak is driven by weather-sensitive loads, air conditioning, right? It's intuitive if you think about it. But look how important that is. Well, one of the things that does is influences how much demand response you can get depending on what part of the planet you live on. We have more is available in the south where it gets really hot. That gives us more that we can control. In fact, this is data from 10,000 homes that Whisker did in the Houston area. We can predict for different, these business hours, 1, 2, and 3, these are different just windows of time. Business hours 1 is from 8 to noon, I think, or 8 to 1. And so we can predict at different temperatures how much load there is that we could reduce, so we can actually correlate between temperature and so on. But the problem is markets, remember, were all designed for power plants. So PJM actually requires now to participate in their auction that if you want a capacity payment, you have to be able to offer capacity 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Well, wait a minute. We just said the real problem is on peak afternoons and meeting that peak demand are these loads. So if you could control those just for a few hours, even a year relatively, this would be incredibly valuable, right? I've spent 2 years trying to fix this problem with PJM, and only later this month the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is holding a technical conference to decide whether that was discriminatory to say that you have to look like a nuclear power plant or a coal or a gas plant to even participate in their auction, even though they have a demand in the winter that is about 25,000 megawatts less than the summer ever. But they now no longer allow seasonal resources participate. I'd say that's pretty clearly discriminatory, but we're making progress. So ERCOT has a weather-sensitive load that home aggregations can participate in, and there are people doing it. We were really the first. I helped define the product here, and it's done in a way that you're not penalized for not being able to give load reduction on a cool afternoon when no air conditioners are running, right? So PJM, I just mentioned, California ISO and their PUC have working groups now finally to discover how can they begin to create a participation model that would allow aggregations of smart homes to participate. New York has taken a little different approach. They are starting to look at, well, instead of just a 24-hour capacity product in their market, maybe they could have something called a peak capacity product, which would allow, again, an aggregation of smart homes to say, yeah, we're not available off-peak because we don't have our air conditioners on, but we know it's variable, but it's very predictable how much we would have at peak. So if you have a market in which we could sell that, we could be compensated. So and Ontario is just starting up a capacity market. But this just shows what an event might look like where we reduce power on the system. The point I made earlier, I just wanted to repeat, demand response is kind of like a thermal storage resource, right? You have a certain amount of thermal momentum in the home. You can turn the air conditioner off for a little while or turn it down, turn the thermostat back, and the momentum of the home will carry it for a period of time and you don't notice. Maybe you're home, maybe you're not. But if you don't notice and you don't mess with it, then we capture that reduction. But in order, again, to create the resource, you've got to enroll the customers in the program, so that's kind of a barrier. Again, all these things that I call barriers, remember, is opportunity for a job for you someday in the future. The marketing of this, how you talk to customers, get them interested in it. It also requires advanced metering. You've got to be able to actually demonstrate for all these homes that you had a reduction, which, by the way, is counterfactual, that as you're trying to prove something that didn't happen, how much would we have used had we not reduced? There's a whole series of things going on around the country. We're using random control tests and other kinds of tests to baseline and determine how much savings actually occurred. And by every one of those wholesale markets have different rules, by the way, and so we're trying to get standards developed there. And then finally, just to get access to your meter data and share it with Nest or Honeywell, you have to go through a long process, and we're trying to simplify and standardize that, but we got a long ways to go. Yeah. Yes. If you go to the ERCOT website, ERCOT.com, there are protocols. There's about 1,500 pages.
Yeah, it's like a model.
Well, I mean, that in itself is kind of a barrier, right? I mean, the average person is overwhelmed by that. And I've been doing this for years, and I only know segments of those rules that I have to know for things, right? And my clients have people who spend their lives down in the weeds of this, and some of it's, I mean, the mathematical calculations associated with proving up whether or not 100,000 homes actually reduced a certain amount for a period of time, all that is very technical. So there's a huge number of jobs evolving in these relatively technical areas of how we go about it, really sort of making happen the promise of the smart grid that in theory seems really simple, right? In fact, let me tell you one more thing. So my new company, which I can't tell you much about, I have to wipe this tape out, but right now, DOE and the White House for about a decade have been promoting something called Green Button Connect as a way for customers to share their meter data. So if Nest came to you and said, could we offer you a service to make your thermostat more efficient? You go, oh yeah. Well, today they have to say, okay, one, if your utility has advanced meter infrastructure, and two, if they've adopted Green Button, you have to go to the utility website, create an account, a username and a password, and then go find a drop-down menu of providers and find us on that and click yes, and then what? Right? We've just lost everybody. In fact, a study done by Energy Hub and Alarm.com showed 3% of the customers that had their homes security and software and thermostat made it through that process to participate in demand response. Now in Texas, where ERCOT has the meter data, it's the only ISO that does it themselves, they had 48%. So it's viable here, it's not viable there. So what's needed is actually in every utility, even if, I mean, they all adopted Green Button, there's so many of them, it's so complex that, again, Nest would have to integrate with 3,000 utilities across North America. And it's all done in a way that's more utility-centric than customer-centric, when really what you need is a single cloud-based application that would allow a customer to just say yes, give a couple piece of information on their thumbs while they're shopping or on a mobile device, and then let the third parties take care of the authentication, the authorization, the access to the data, prove it up to the market, control the thermostat. All that needs to happen out of sight of the customer if this is going to happen. And that's not yet happening either, right? So this is kind of the next piece I'm working on, is we've got to be able to make it easy for customers to be able to simply say, yes, I'd like to do the right thing. I'd like to contribute, be more socially responsible or environmentally responsible or something. instead of, I got to do what? Because we aren't going to do that for the little contribution we make. Anyway, I'm sorry. I guess I talked too much. Are we out of time? We're not out of time.
We're not out of time.
We've got 5 more minutes for
Sure,
questions.
yeah, sure. We can certainly go a little later if people have questions. So we can take questions, or if you have a couple other things of note to go on there. I'll throw one question out. So there's this. I suppose we're at a time, perhaps, in this country where we're starting to really debate data getting shared, and people on Capitol Hill asking about whose data were shared and taken or allowed, or this kind of thing. And is the electric industry, or electricity, what's going on in the home? Is there something about it that makes it be a victim to whatever else is going on? Is there something about it that actually makes it more viable than just my shopping habits? Is it something that protects it and makes it more? If there is a backlash against sharing data, is there something about the grid and electricity that could not be affected by that, just by, it's a more physical thing than just money and numbers?
All the states are very concerned about protecting electric data. I know utilities have worked with the FBI to find pot houses in states where growing pot's not legal, for example. You can tell a lot of things, as I said earlier, from looking at somebody's electric meter, right? So, and industrials are worried about competitors knowing how much they're using when and whatever. Anyway, I would say mostly it's not as bad today because it's not real-time data. It tends to be delayed 24 to 48 hours, but it's granular enough that you can tell a lot about it. So protecting privacy is important. One of the problems with the current system, though, with every utility adopting a portal for data sharing with their customers, is that some of them do it okay, some of them don't do it as well, right? We really need higher quality security layer, authentication layer, somehow to protect that data, but also make it simple. Because we want the benefits of the digital technology, but we want our privacy. So there's a lot of work to be done in that whole space. Again, lots of jobs available.
Yeah, that's kind of a good question. I guess there's a protocol for using your credit card online and securing that, and you're basically saying, well, we don't have that yet for sharing electricity data, but something similar would need to come about.
Yeah. Well, in fact, one of the dangers, if we don't do what I'm talking about, of creating a single cloud-based authentication system like the ATM system, right, where you can facilitate transactions and make them simple, people are learning on how to go around the system in ways that are not good for security. Like there are companies today telling the customer, well, give me certain private information, I'll go set up your account for you, because it's the only way they're going to get it done. But now they're into the customer's account. So that's really bad protocol for security, right? Because you're giving a third party access to your utility account. Now they could be doing other things with your account, have access to money and other things, right? So really we need to get this right to make it simple, but also keep it secure if we want this to go well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was interesting. I think you put a lot of thoughts in my head that haven't come into my head before, but including how could you affect voting or something? You're like, well, I'm going to make everybody's air conditioner break right before voting day, so they have to call and try to figure out how to fix it, and then nobody goes to vote on voting day or something.
Well, and that's a whole nother set of conversations about Internet of Things themselves need to be harder to hack. But yeah.
Do you foresee as a utility of the homes using battery pack, like Tesla battery pack, in the near future to smooth the demand curve and just makes everything smoother than what it is currently in terms of demand and supply?
I do see a time when even homes might use storage. Tesla walls, that's the slick Tesla version that's relatively expensive, so I don't think it's cost justified. Install one here in Texas for peak shaving or something. But I mean, it's a cool product, and they're selling it to thousands of people with Tesla cars and other things that want to do the right thing. But I'll tell you, there are other things coming along. Storage prices have come way down, just like LED lights and some of the other new technology that's having big impact. And there's something like 126 model electric cars that have been announced now. Maybe Trump will push some of those off for a while, but the commitments and announcements that have been made are huge. And if you think about where will all those car batteries go, that's what's going to, there are already secondary markets being created for the batteries. Because think about it, in your car you need the car battery to have very high power density because it's heavy already and you want to get a number of miles out of it, right? When it starts losing its energy density, the capacity goes down, they change them out. Well, those batteries still have life, they're just, the density is down. But in your garage, who cares, right? A little more space in the garage is not a big deal, or in a closet someplace. So I think what you're going to see is a much faster expansion of a secondary market for a lot of car batteries going into new products that then are way cheaper because they've already been paid for almost, right? You're just paying for the reconditioning and reintegration into a home package or a business package or something. So I think, yeah.
Do you see the Austin utility or other places in Texas doing demand-based pricing? I heard in Austin the barrier is like their accounting system. Do you know anything about that?
You're talking about like the meter readers misreading all the meters? I have to admit, I live here, but I have spent 3 to 4 days a week on the road across North America, and I'm not totally sure what Austin Energy is doing. They've got green power rates, and they've got, they do have demand response. Austin suffers from the fact that they were one of the first to roll out advanced meters, and so they have only one-way communicating meters, so they don't, you know, now the ones going in are two-way communicating, so you can tell right away what's happening there, and with the backhaul. So Austin's going to have to upgrade their meters to do certain kinds of things, but they still have a fair number of us, including me, on a program where with a radio signal they can turn down my thermostat. And they have a time of use rate option and some other things, so there are other ways in which they're doing. They even have, what do you call it, a bring your own thermostat program that Whisker and Honeywell and Nest, you can pick which thermostat you want, and each of those device makers or integrators control your thermostat according to signals from Austin, and they use it quite a bit. One of the things, you know, the first entrance in demand response market was actually large industrials, and it was really kind of a replacement for what we used to call economic rates or interruptible rates. So if you were a factory, we wanted the economic development of the factory, but you're a big energy user, so you want low prices. So one of the ways we justified offering these economic development rates was we'd say, okay, but if there is an event where it looks like the lights are all going to go off, you agree to be interrupted. To avoid that, we'll give you like 4-cent rate. So those interruptible rates were available pretty much everywhere for many years, but when you get to a market, all of a sudden the utility doesn't set the rate, it's competitive, right? So we created this market in which those same customers could bid their willingness to be interrupted as demand response. And in fact, we have a specific product, RRS, the responsive reserve product, in which you have to have an interruption device on the site. So if the frequency drops below a certain level, you automatically come off, or you have to be able to respond in 10 minutes and the whole, you know, some chunk of load can come off. That was demand response. Well, with residential and commercial air conditioning or pool pumps or water heaters, actually there's some really nice things happening in water heaters and heat pump water heaters in particular. Variability that you can have on these, the control is pretty significant. You can call these all the time. Austin calls their program 30 or 40 times a summer, I think. So they're quite useful resources. We just have to fight this battle with all the markets and all the states and all the utilities and all the generators to find a way to let us fairly participate in that and be compensated in a way that creates a business model that can allow it to proliferate.
I think I'll ask one more question.
That's kind of the
maybe.
bottom line of my speech, by the way, right?
Yeah. I think I'll ask one more question. So, and sort of tying your ideas that perhaps old car batteries can become batteries in homes. Maybe batteries become cheap enough to put stuff in homes. There's difficulty in aggregating demand response at different nodes because you need a certain number of customers at a certain number of nodes. And all these kinds of things considered, I guess at least in ERCOT, you seem to imply that the rules are set up maybe the best for aggregation and demand response in ERCOT versus other places. Do you think the rules are set up to allow all these kind of things to happen, right? If I can aggregate, say I'm supposed to aggregate 100 people, but I only have 50, if I can afford storage to make it look like there's an extra 50, I can invest in the storage and potentially act like it's 50 people and serve this aggregation service. Do you feel like the rules are
well,
set up
you
to do
can
that?
use
If the
storage.
economics work, the rules are set up to do it. It's just, does it ever make sense?
You can use storage to do demand response. There's no limitation on how you do demand response. In California, they prohibit fossil fuel-based backup generators from coming on. Here we don't. So for instance, in Houston, after all the storms, all the water districts are required by law to have backup generators. Well, they're paying for those generators by selling demand response to ERCOT because all they have to do is turn on the generator and run their plant on that, and to ERCOT it looks like their demand just went to zero, right? Now, and the other nice thing is if the system still goes down, the water system is running, they still have their backup generator. So the backup generator serves as the emergency function that it had in mind, but it can actually run ahead of time before the lights go off and maybe prevent them from going off, which is better for everybody. Now, in ERCOT, I was saying that for those of you hardy enough to stick around, we just have a system-wide call. That's for emergency response service. If you are a retail electric provider, you can vary your load with your customers at any time, and that affects your demand at every one of the nodes and what your responsibility is for delivering power at every one of the nodes, and is calculated at every one of the nodes. What we haven't done yet is created a pathway through which customer on their own or with a third-party aggregator like a Nest Rush Hour Rewards program could directly participate in the energy market. It's not even allowed. And it's for a variety of reasons that you've got to completely redo the back office computer software that figures out how to do that, how to allocate costs, because for instance, every customer is associated with one retail electric provider, but if that electric provider is your provider and some other demand response provider reduces your power, actually the benefit of that goes to the supplier because they didn't have to supply as much. They just say thank you very much, but there's not a system to compensate the guy that put in the controls to reduce your demand, right? So all these things, again, lots of jobs, there's more jobs. Figure out how to do that physically and the rules, the laws, you know, all this needs a lot of work still, so.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.